My name is Tim Fernholz. I'm a senior reporter at Quartz, the global business news site. I'm really excited to be here at the Planet Explorer conference today with what I will guarantee is the best breakout session of the entire time. Not to put too much pressure on my panelists here, but thank you all for attending. The title of our panel, I just want to make sure I get this straight, is Always on Earth Observation, Adjusting to a New Paradigm in Global Transparency. And basically, we're here to do the inverse of the discussion that Sue Gordon had this morning with Robbie. She was talking about how the government is going to take advantage of all the new commercial imagery coming from Planet and companies like it. We're going to talk about what happens when imagery and data from space that is good enough for the government is in the hands of open source researchers, what it means for transparency on a bunch of important geopolitical issues around the world, and how it's changing the way journalists and open source analysts work. I think we're all familiar with the fact that in the last decade we've seen a new range of space companies providing this data, Planet being a leader among them, and it's really changed the way people work. So I'm going to introduce our panel here today. To my immediate right is Allison Puccioni. She's from the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University, a longtime open source imagery analyst. Then we have Jeffrey Lewis. He's the director of the East Asia Non-Proliferation Project at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, right down the road in Monterey. And then finally, we have Christoph Körtl. He is a visual investigations journalist at the New York Times. I would say these are three of the foremost people using Planet data to tell incredible stories that we would not have access to otherwise. I spend a lot of my time in my own work kind of chasing them around, so it's cool to get them on a stage to talk about it. To start off, the first question is, what happened before Planet? What kind of open source imagery were you able to use from remote Earth sensing spacecraft? And maybe to start with Allison, you started a magazine for Janes that was one of the first big clearinghouses for this kind of info. How did you convince people to share it, and why weren't they at the time?
Yeah, I mean, take you all the way back to 2008. And excellent introduction, thank you. But to give you a little bit of context, sort of imagery that starts to approach a little bit of a higher resolution was long relegated from open source use. We all kind of know that. And then when you start to look at things that are potentially of strategic or military significance, you really didn't have that much information until actually the first 1 meter resolution satellite was launched 1999. First imagery was available 2000. I had worked for a long time in the intelligence community, other communities, and by 2008, the British publication Janes asked me to start working completely open source, and I told them no. I didn't think there would be a satellite imagery capability that was readily available enough for me to ply my trade, so to speak. Janes, very lucky for me, convinced me otherwise. At the time, in 2008, there was the Icono satellite. It was from Space Imaging and then GEOINT. And then Digital Globe had a satellite called the QuickBird. So you had two satellites in 2008. And you basically, that meant revisit, if we want to talk revisit. You had stories where you could look at something maybe once or twice a year. 2007, there wasn't a Chinese submarine base. 2008, guess what? An entire Chinese submarine base had been built, and there was now a Chinese Type 091 class submarine deployed at that. So you had a very broad before and after picture. I will just say one more thing. Within the next 10 years, you got something like 36 more satellites from a number of other organizations, including the Dove constellation, which has really been an absolute game changer in allowing us to see a lot of imagery. So long story a little shorter, 2008, I had two satellites to work with. If one went out of operation, Janes told me they would fire me. Today, the bottleneck is no longer whether or not you get satellite imagery, but it's are there enough analysts or researchers or people interested enough to parse this data that I think the public is so interested in.
And Christoph, before you went to the Times, you worked at a human rights organization, and I'm curious, what kind of remote sensing data were you working with then, and now what are you doing with it at the Times? How has that changed?
Sure. I mean, as Alison was explaining, it was a very limited availability of imagery. That didn't mean human rights researchers were able to use it. one example that I always bring up, which is, I think, a really telling and great example, was the US Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. I think it was around 2002. They published a report on political prison camps in North Korea. And that report contained a lot of high-resolution, sub-meter resolution satellite images. I think the report would have been possible without the satellite imagery, but it would have looked completely different. So it was a really incredible sort of like step forwards from sort of like a human rights and research perspective, that you were suddenly able to take advantage of the first high-resolution commercial satellite images. And it's very telling that this example, covers a country that's completely sealed off, right? Because that's the point. You can suddenly look for information in places that are inaccessible. And that can be, in the case of North Korea, you're not allowed to go there. It's not a war zone, but you, as a journalist or as an independent observer, you just cannot go there and investigate yourself. The next examples are around 2004, when Amnesty started using satellite imagery. And the first time they used it was in Darfur, which was a completely conflict-ridden zone at that point. So you could not go because of a physical security risk. And again, satellite images allowed you to do at least some basic research. So that's sort of like how I got into that field. Starting around 2006, 2007, I started looking at satellite images, again, mainly from a human rights perspective. And I did that for 10 years, so I saw the progression. And the progression mainly was me getting like JPEG images from experts or from satellite image provider towards myself using the satellite imagery, meaning the actual data. And that really changed a lot, I think, with the Planet Explorer that I'm using a lot now, that initially I did not use so much because of the spatial resolution. So the things I looked at really required a very high resolution. But especially being a journalist, I think it really changed my workflow. So when I come into the office in the morning, my job is to look for what's in the news today, what are the stories of the day. And one of the first things I do is look for image availability on the one hand, but also look at Planet satellite imagery to see sort of like if there's something I can do with that. So that's sort of like definitely a dramatic shift in the workflow from occasionally requesting satellite images for a specific project and getting a JPEG to like logging in and looking at the satellite imagery in real time almost, but also being able to download the data, manipulating it on a very basic level. That's sort of like my sort of like perspective of like how this really changed on a personal level also.
As someone who's not trained in geospatial imaging, like the transition in the last few years from receiving an enormous file that you can't open yourself to like logging onto a website and seeing just a picture of something you can download easily, it's been like the blink of an eye. One thing I think as a journalist that I'm always doing is you hear about a North Korea missile test or Iran is going to launch a satellite, and I normally go to Jeffrey's Twitter feed to see what he and his team have learned about it. And so I'm curious, Jeffrey, if you can talk a little bit about how you use Planet imagery to do the work you're doing in Middlebury.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been kind of an incredible experience because, when I started in this field in the late 1990s, commercial images were things like Landsat, or slightly better was the French Spot. And you really, when you worked with that imagery, you were really trying to infer things. So there's a famous Landsat image allegedly showing the Soviets practicing popping up through the ice to launch a missile, but it's like 30-meter resolution. So what it is it's a hole in the ice and a circular condensation cloud that's from the airplane flying around it. And somebody inferred, right, that there must be a submarine, which you couldn't see, and there must be an airplane, which you couldn't see. And that was really inadequate. And so for me, the kind of frustrating moment was the run-up to the Iraq War, where there were all these claims about the capabilities that the Iraqis had or were developing, and civil society could say nothing, right? We just couldn't. And then now we can, right? And so actually, I love the set of images that are playing behind us. There's one that'll come up in a second that I think really well illustrates that. North Korea did a missile test, and the South Korean government tried to pretend that they didn't, right? They referred to it as a projectile. It's this one, actually. This is the image. And when we got this image, we realized, like, this is the plume of the missile. Like, we knew there was a missile test, and we knew what time the missile test had happened. And so on the one hand, you had the South Korean government trying to hide this fact. And I think as Robbie and Sue Gordon talked about, on the other hand, you had the fact of this image, right? And so for me, that's just a really powerful change that governments can have their version of events, but we have facts that we can use to hold them to account.
And have you found that having those facts is changing things on like a functional level? How are governments responding when you say, actually, we do have a picture of this missile launch, it did happen?
Yeah, one thing is, I think transparency begets transparency. I think we have seen a number of cases, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill, where if the government wants to make the case for doing something, because people are so used to seeing satellite images and other kinds of data, it raises the bar for what the government has to do to be persuasive. Sometimes I wish the government would act when it doesn't. Sometimes I wish the government wouldn't act when it does, so it's never perfect. But I do think it is this really powerful change that if the US government says something is true, just trust us, that's not good enough for people, because you can't tell people that satellite images are classified. I guess you could say it, but they've seen them, right? And so they expect a certain level of information.
If I can, I've been nodding violently, but if I can absolutely jump in. I completely agree with Jeffrey. I'll go back to the fact that during the run-up to the Iraq War, the government released some of its own national technical means to try to say, hey, this is what's happening here, and this is why we need to go to war. I think in the past 10 or 15 years, you've seen an incredible increase in literacy, sort of satellite imagery literacy that the public has. The public has the right to be informed. The public wants to be informed. And they're starting to learn, or they have learned through the works of Jeffrey Lewis and a lot of other, actually a small handful rather, of other organizations, how to consume satellite imagery in a way that makes sense to them, in a way where you can use this as quantifiable information. So I'm completely in agreement. I think that there have been folks in certain professions that have been gatekeepers of information. And as we increase our own awareness and understanding, and frankly increase our access to data, we have the power to be able to consume this information as part of the regular news cycle that we have been and become more informed. There are nothing but problems as this technology emerges, right? But I think if there are literate people who want to foster transparency in the open source or the media community, we just kind of got to keep plugging away and plying our trade as best we can in an effort to do this.
One kind of related question, as more of this imagery becomes available to experts like you guys, to laymen like me, what are the sort of skills or best practices people should keep in mind when they're using this imagery? How much do they need to corroborate with ground truth? I know Jeffrey trains people to do this, but I'm curious, all three of you, what should people keep in mind when they see a satellite image? What can they conclude from it?
I think there are a lot of answers to that. I think, obviously, with any story from a journalistic perspective, you don't want to rely on one source, right? So if you consider the satellite image a source, you don't want to just use this one image and build your story around that. It's also, I think there are two things. Number one, it's around accuracy. So you really want to corroborate the story and what you see in the satellite image, even if it's a very clear satellite image. But also from a storytelling perspective, if I just have the satellite image and then write a little bit to that or show something around that, it might not be as compelling as getting in touch with people who might be in that area that the satellite image shows. What happened there? You might talk to experts who give you maybe a different perspective. So I think you really want to combine different sources. I think that's one of the most important things. Then what you hear a lot, I think, is don't just look at one satellite image, because that's, I think, one trap you can fall into very easily. Is I see a change here, but how can you tell it's a change if it's a single satellite image? Also look at a wider area. I made that mistake repeatedly. I'm looking at one specific, let's say an airstrike or any other event. So I'm only looking at this, but you want to look around it and you suddenly find troops in the area or something like that. So I think there are a lot of things like that you want to be careful, as with any other. It's not a magic bullet, right? So that's the key to understand.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just jump in. like any human endeavor, there are people who are good at this, and there are people who are bad at this, and then there are people who are just simply creating disinformation, right? And so there are, we're an educational institution, and so we try to train people. And the two kind of examples that I think of, which come up is, one is there was a story not too long ago in a Korean newspaper that showed that this barge that North Korea used to launch missiles had been basically moved out to sea for a test. And it was, they had taken an image and they had like cut it. And so I went to Planet, and this is like the joy, right, of this. I think they'd had a high resolution image, right, that cut off. And so I got the full image in Planet, and I'm like, no, the barge is still there. That's a different barge. And like, did you idiots measure it, And the answer is they didn't measure it because they wanted the story, right? So, making sure you look at all the available data is something that you can now do, which you used to not be able to do, right? If you got a picture and it was cut off, that was the information you have. But now you can get multiple images from multiple satellites. And then the second one is integrating a little bit of cultural knowledge. An institution that shall go unnamed published this really beautiful set of high-resolution images showing that China had really clamped down on sanctions on North Korea because there were no vehicles at the border crossings, right? And they had a pair, right, a before and an after picture. But having spent a fair amount of time in Asia, and particularly China, I noticed that the after picture was on the Spring Festival, which is when Chinese truck drivers are hungover. And we actually worked with Planet at that point to do a kind of, this was a few years ago, a rudimentary vehicle counting, where we took all of their 3-meter images and we counted the vehicles. And you could see, people work less on weekends, they work more during the week, they stop working on holidays, and then traffic had picked back up. So there are best practices, but I would make the point that the best practices are now really reinforced by the fact that there is so much more data that allow you to check your confirmation bias if you're just willing to.
And if I can quickly jump in, I want to say, like, the question of, how do we publish our imagery? I think it's the onus is on the imagery analyst or the analyst institution to publish something that's intuitive to the reader. Don't just say, hey, this is what I think that this is. Show your reader why you think it's that. We're all the same people. We all have eyes. The sighted human being needs to understand why you think this is the way that you think it. What are all your secondary sources? And I think, Center for Nonproliferation Studies has done an excellent job. I've done some work with CSAC as well, where you kind of write a dossier of why you think this is the way that this is. And I think this is so important. I think the biggest conundrum right now in the industry is satellite imagery amplifies the exposure of almost any published article significantly. Janes once did a little study, it was 10 years ago, but if you put a satellite image next to almost any block of text, the internet viewer will click it about 90% more than anything else.
I can confirm this.
Yeah, it's very significant. And so you have organizations that are very interested in the research. You also have organizations that, the more you publish, the more you're well-known, and the more you're well-known, that's where your grant money comes from. So we have seen in some cases, there have been stories that didn't quite cut the mustard, and yet they were published anyway, because A, that's going to get you exposure, and B, and Jeffrey and Chris will attest to this, there are not very many people who are imagery analysts in security that can refute that. I think the amount of data that we're starting to see with Planet, with a couple of other organizations, and the kind of increase in people who are interested in analyzing and researching with this data is helping everybody. I think it's kind of leading to a good academic debate or academic pluralism in the industry.
Earlier you mentioned that transparency begets transparency, and people expect to get a certain kind of evidence from the government now. And I'm not sure if those are the reasons for this, but President Trump recently tweeted a satellite image of an Iranian satellite launch attempt. Planet's same image has been up there off and on during this discussion. A big question that I always have is how good are Planet's capabilities compared to, say, the CIA spy satellites, NRO, I should be more accurate in this room. Allison can't speak to this as a former federal employee, but I'm interested for you two. What do you think Planet's capabilities compare to the US government's, and what did you learn from that photo that President Trump shared?
I still can't believe he did that. You know, there are special capabilities that do not yet reside in the commercial sector. So if you look at the photograph that President Trump tweeted, what was so remarkable about it was that it was very oblique. The satellite was very low in the sky when it took the picture. And that means typically you're photographing through a lot of atmosphere. And that's very hard to deal with. And we know the US government has invested, well, Allison's just the sphinx there. Yeah, the US government has invested in adaptive optics, right? The ability to sharpen and correct and deal with atmospheric distortion. And what was shocking to me about Trump's photograph is how good that is, right? Because it wasn't merely, I think, an issue of resolution. It was an issue of dealing with all the atmospheric turbulence that I would have expected to see. So that's something that doesn't exist on the commercial side. On the other hand, there's something really different about the commercial satellite universe today, and I think that Planet really illustrates that, which is back in even if you were sitting on the classified side, nobody was taking a picture of the Earth every day at any resolution. And some of the images that we're cycling through are dove images that are 3 to 5 meters, and they're not as sharp, but they are taken on the day we need them. You know, so if you think of that North Korean missile taking off, a beautiful, much higher resolution image taken a day later is worthless to me, right? Because the missile is gone. So cadence is a new thing that exists. And in terms of resolution, you know, I would argue that the difference in the past, when the commercial side had, or the open side had Landsat, right? And then you had classified satellites that were sub-meter. That was an enormous difference. When you live today where commercial satellites are 50 to 30 centimeters, and then the classified government capabilities are a little better than that, that gap isn't as meaningful as it once was. You know, there are things they can see that we can't, but it's a smaller and more unique subset of things. Now, I mean, if somebody wants to give me a better image, I'll take it, right? But I think that we sometimes forget that even if there's a gap between the classified and the unclassified systems, we have so much open data now that we can do like 90% of the work.
Are there other examples, Allison or Christoph, of times when the high revisit and the cadence were able to help you in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm a late fan to the temporal resolution. I always preferred the spatial resolution because of the sort of the conflict work I was doing before. I just needed very, very high resolution imagery. But over the last year, I did 2 stories where just like the revisit time made a massive difference. So, and I think you saw both examples before in the slides. One was we were trying to track a specific ship that was transporting a specific good to North Korea. Nothing to do with rockets, but it was a high luxury Mercedes. There's an international ban on luxury goods to North Korea. So we tried to track that shipment. And a ship is moving, right? So I had like certain positions where the ship was on certain days. And because we had the high revisit time, I actually was able to visually show to our viewers, here's the ship, here it's picking up the cars, that sort of thing. So that was incredibly useful for storytelling purposes, but also sort of to corroborate actually the story that we already had. In another instance that you saw, which I think was a really, really fun and interesting project from my perspective, was when we looked at a suspected CIA drone base in Niger. So we got some reports. Somebody was in a little town in Niger, and he stayed there overnight and heard at 8 in the evening drones flying, but very, very close by. So that was how the story started, right? So the question that came to us is, can you take a look? So we took a look, right? And I went back to 6 months of Planet satellite imagery, and I saw how the drone base slowly emerged. But the nice thing was then we tasked the SkySat and got the high-res image and did the proper analysis that we could show to our viewers, right? So that's sort of, for me, the perfect example how you combine the 2 things, and also where the revisit time makes a big difference, because I could pinpoint this like, oh, this drone base started to being constructed on around February 13th of 2019, I believe, right? So you can really pinpoint a specific date, which was extremely useful, I think. So it's, in a way, it's a little bit a very simple tipping and queuing, right? I'm sure in the government they do this a little bit better. It's a fun example because you turn these assets that come from the government, or the technology initially comes from the government, you turn it around and put a CA drone base in the spotlight. So it's, for me, it's a perfect example where, where we got with this technology.
This morning we had some announcements. Planet is improving their service. They're going to be adding new bands of color to their doves. They're going to be trying to get 50 centimeters with the SkySats. My question here was going to be, what is on your wish list for new capabilities? But I'm also curious how you think those two things will play into your work for anyone who wants to take it.
Want to take it? I can start.
Sure.
First of all, I mean, the temporal cadence, I absolutely echo Chris and Jeffrey. They're, the behavior of buildings and structures that have strategic and military significance is just much more granular when you can see it on a sort of twice a week or even now intraday. It changes the game in how to do imagery analysis. I've just completed a project that's using 8-band multispectral imagery, and it looks pretty solid that we have found some multispectral signatures of material that are used for nuclear proliferation. And to be able to kind of monitor that on a very high cadence basis is very attractive. So I love the idea of multispectral. And then again, using sort of the 3-meter resolution, the very constant imagery, to give you a broad idea of what kind of activity you want to see. And then once you see that activity or a faint possibility of that activity, it's amazing to be able to move from 3 meters to a 50 centimeter. Frankly, it's amazing to move from 3 meters to 80 centimeters with the SkySats, but 50 centimeter gives you a little bit more of acute granularity, and it might be interesting to use a stepped approach of resolution the closer you get to publishing, because you might know it for yourself, but I think, again, you really want to be able to show your public why you are saying what you are saying, and resolution helps you do that.
Yeah, I think the exciting thing about this, and the best part about being at an academic institution, is I don't feel obligated to know, right, what I'm going to be able to do with 8 bands. Like, the kind of joy of my life is I'm going to get to discover that. So I'm pretty excited about the Super Doves. And I think in general, I think all of us who work with satellite imagery are really interested in the non-optical bands. And starting with getting much better thermal than we currently get, moving on to weirder and wilder things.
What would thermal help you unveil or find?
Oh my gosh. So I always think of this as like, was that terrible movie, The Event Horizon, where the guy gouges out his eyes and he says like, where we're going, you don't need eyes to see. Like, that's where this conversation is going, right?
Or Predator, how Predator finds everybody. That's
yeah. So to know if a nuclear reactor is operating.
Yeah.
Right. I want to know if it's hot. I want to know if it's discharging hot water into a river. And so, there was a discussion some years ago about whether North Korea had turned its reactor back on, and as a community, we really didn't know, because the Landsat image was such a big, it was 100 meters downsampled to 30, it's just crazy, right? So basically the whole reactor is a pixel. Mm-hmm. And so we're having this stupid argument about how bright this pixel is, right? And if you could get to a situation where you had better resolution thermal, you would know a lot more about industrial processes.
And I was lucky enough to be in the room where Jeffrey and we were in Monterey, and we were looking at synthetic aperture radar, which is another type of satellite. And it was right after North Korea did a nuclear test that was the device was so large that the mountain sort of subsided. I think Jeffrey is quoted saying that it looked like it was breathing. It exhaled. So there was a lot of yelling and shouting,
yeah,
but that sort of geoprecision and elevation data that you get immediately from SAR,
yeah.
They were able to GIF mountain before, mountain after, mountain before, mountain after. And being able to utilize that kind of information, the SAR data, in addition to some of the thermal and the multispectral platforms. If we can get that a little bit more readily, I think that would be interesting too.
And I think one thing that would be really nice, I really like the Sentinel Hub Playground and US Observer, I think it's called. So it's web-based applications where you actually can manipulate the bands in a browser. So as a journalist who maybe looks at 10 different items in the morning and I just want to do a quick scan, if I would download all the imagery and then open it in ArcGIS and manipulate, half of my day is gone. So I can't really do that. But with a tool like that, I think you can do it very easily and very quickly. So you can look at false color imagery, you can look at radar imagery in your web browser. So that doesn't currently exist, for example, in the Planet Explorer, and with more bands coming online, that could be something really interesting, I think. It's a really useful tool. You manipulate in your browser, you take a screenshot, and you share it with your colleagues, or you tweet it out if you want to, right? And it's very useful to highlight deforestation or new burning in the Amazon, attacked villages somewhere by just using false color imagery comes back to thermal, right? All of that will be detected. So that's something that would be something very simple to do, I guess, and something really useful.
Before we just turn to questions, I want to go back real quickly just to the impact of what this data, the impact this data is having. You know, we've talked a lot about North Korea tonight, this afternoon. Jeffrey, I know you've thought about this a lot. You wrote a very terrifying book about it. I'm just curious from Jeffrey, from all of you, with so much analysis now of North Korea's nuclear and weapons programs compared to similar debates that we had in, say, the 1990s, how does the proliferation of open source analysis change the way we talk about or understand the situation?
Well, I think one thing is that we have a more robust discussion. One of my colleagues at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies is this guy, Sandy Spector, and Sandy wrote these great books, these tomes on proliferation. And if you look at one of these books today, they kind of represented everything we knew. They're sort of all words, and they're all descriptions of nuclear programs where someone is telling him something, right? So he's a serious analyst. He's reading everything, and he's talking to lots of people, but it's all this active telling. And then he's turning around and telling us. And it's just at some level inaccessible. It's very technical, it's very dry. I don't think Sandy is deliberately gatekeeping, but there becomes a gatekeeping function. This is not a book you're going to pick up off a shelf to read for fun, right? And I think today, because this stuff is so much more visual, it's not merely that there is more information for people to analyze, although there is that. I think it is also more inherently accessible. And so, when I meet, I deal with students, so I meet younger people, they aren't terrified by the thick book of words that, frankly, even I don't want to read. They're looking at this picture, they're like, I know that's a launch pad. I can do that, right? And so I think it brings people in, and it allows media to cover these things in a very vibrant way, and it helps us, I think, have a better, more open debate. And I'm a big believer in openness and democracy, and so I think that to the extent that these conversations can be held on an open basis with a big participation of civil society, we're not always going to get perfect outcomes, but I think over the long run we'll get better ones.
I agree. I think that large book, a huge book of what's happening, it democratizes information if we can take that huge book, distill it, provide either the similar amount of information in a smaller space, right? And I think satellite imagery helps you kind of say, hey, these are the 50 things that are happening. I think between social media, between satellite imagery, and now you're kind of looking at metrics, right? I mean, I would love to show everybody a 50-slide presentation of satellite imagery over North Korea, but now we can have a graph showing you what reactor is operational what month, right? And so you just took my 50-slide presentation and it's now a single slide that shows you reactor capability. And if you know which nuclear reactor is active in a month, and you can plot that over several years, you actually have an ability to estimate the amount of nuclear weapons material that a country has. And you can communicate that not in your huge book anymore, but immediately. I mean, Jeffrey could tweet something like that out, and now a lot of people who are used to read long newspapers can now kind of absorb a very large amount of information that took a lot of work in an intuitive and a palatable way.
And I just have to ask now also, has it gotten to the point yet, and it was mentioned this morning earlier, the idea of satellite deepfakes, that you're worried about fake satellite imagery influencing the debate?
I'm not so much worried about sort of like the actual data or the image is fake. So at this discussion over lunch, actually, it helps me a lot to present facts in a good way because I can present this is an image of this location at this time, and everyone can repeat my process. It becomes a very scientific process. I cannot do that with all the social media content I'm working on, which is sort of the other part of my work, right? Like we pull stuff from social media to do analysis and investigations. People can raise questions with the satellite image. That doesn't really happen, so it helps me to establish the facts. That does not mean the satellite image cannot be photoshopped. And that can be very simple, and Russia is doing this on a regular basis in Syria. They publish a satellite image to debunk that they say like, oh, we're debunking the story that we hit a mosque in Syria, but they're putting the label, the date label over the mosque that was hit and showing a different mosque. That's not even photoshopping, it's just simple manipulation, right, and misinformation. So it's a regular visual that you can use for misinformation, but at the same time, I think it's very helpful to establish very specific facts.
Yeah, I've found that we've dealt with some Russian satellite images that we believe were manipulated, and it turns out I think it's kind of a difficult thing to manipulate an image. I mean, I suppose it's easy to manipulate it, but it's hard to do it in a way that's very compelling because for commercial images, there's a sort of known process by which those images are taken and come down, right? And I suppose if Dr. Evil purchased Planet, you could get to a situation where he was, seeding the catalog with false images. But you have many companies taking images, and the manner in which the data is handled, I think, does allow for some level of verification. And so, in the case where the Russians are manipulating things, they're often trying to present the day of something wrong, right? And so, I think Bellingcat did an example where they found an oil leak, and the oil leak was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which then allowed them to put the images in order, right? And it was not the order that the Russians had presented. So, people can always fake things. But the level of aggravation in my life that comes from fake satellite images is much less than the level of aggravation in my life that comes from faked ground truth images.
And now with more of a constellation of satellites, if somebody was going to fake something with their own, for instance, state imagery or another commercial company, it's much, much easier to go to a Planet or another commercial company, look at the same area, same date, and you should have parity if there wasn't a problem. And so I've seen it too. I've seen date manipulation quite a bit. I used to think that could never happen, but people are using every type of information to try to manipulate what information is out there. And there are many ways to sort of avert that. I think it's getting better.
All right. Now we have some time to take some questions from the audience. So if you want to ask one, just raise your hand and I will gesture at you. And I think we have a mic. Anybody?
See somebody right in here?
Oh, yep, right in front of me. Perfect. In the middle there.
Hi, I'm Rob Simon. I'm from Planet. And I'm curious about, you're talking about the use of false color imagery to communicate, and I really like the fact that you were very cognizant of you were communicating to a specific audience. But when you're using false color, what do you do to frame that imagery so that the audience will have the tools to interpret it because it's not familiar imagery?
So the short answer is don't use the false color imagery publicly. So since I'm at the Times, I think we've never used a false color image publicly. I use it on Twitter sometimes, right? And my Twitter followers, a lot of them, they work with satellite imagery, so then they get it. But we had that discussion a lot at my previous job at Amnesty International because we relied on false color imagery and we published the imagery occasionally. So it's very tricky because it's very confusing. So you have to explain it. And we tried that sometimes like in a press release or in the captions, and that didn't work so well. So I think what we started to do a couple of times is I just wrote blog posts explaining the process and what it means. At the times, we do something similar, even though we don't use the false color imagery that much. But we have something called Times Insider. So if you publish a bigger story or investigation, we do a separate piece just sort of telling the audience this is how we did it. So I did that with a story in the Congo, where we used NASA active fire data, and I overlaid that with OpenStreetMap data of populated places, and then identified places where there's fire in the populated places, and then got high-resolution satellite images. We had that in the video very briefly, but it gets very confusing. So why don't we write a separate story explaining that? And people are actually very interested in that sort of stuff. So it comes back to just being transparent and using it as an educational opportunity.
In the front here, yeah.
So the quality of the satellite data information is improving. We talk about 50 centimeters, correct? But as it gets better and better and better, at what point is there an ethical question as to what people can see through the satellite?
I've just run a couple of workshops about high-resolution imagery where it's starting to impede ethics. And I will say, as an imagery analyst, I used to never care about this question until somebody came up to me and said, the technologist should be at the forefront of trying to implement the conversation of, is this ethical, is this unethical? We're right now, I think the highest resolution satellite is the TerraSAR X, which is 25 centimeters commercially. At 15 centimeters, I think that's 4 pixels per face. And I'm not that good of an imagery analyst, but I can recognize, I could recognize somebody's gait and somebody's thing from 15 centimeters. So we're about 10 centimeters off the potential for facial recognition. Now, European Union is already starting to consider right to privacy in terms of satellite image collection. It sounds crazy to me that they would ever regulate the collection of satellite imagery, but the Open Skies Agreement, I think, has to do with the collection of satellite imagery, and that's in question, if I'm not mistaken. And the debate is happening. Ethics not only come into question with respect to facial recognition or being able to track somebody, but they also come into question with if Jeffrey, for instance, gets satellite imagery and he's the first person to see, a reactor explode. What should Jeffrey do? So there are a lot of questions that we have around satellite imagery. What actors are able to use this? It's almost a little difficult to unpack a lot of it, but
So I think you have to think about it on a case-by-case basis what the risk is, but that's with any other visual, right? If I publish it as the New York Times, I'm exposing, or I'm giving this person a lot of exposure, right? And might put him at risk. With satellite images in general, what I like about it is that you cannot, that the images that I use and that we publish, you cannot identify individuals, right? So you don't have that specific risk that you would have with an Egyptian protester. That doesn't mean there is risk associated with that. So we had many situations at Amnesty where, we were careful what we publish. We thought about, should we publish the coordinates, which we know people will figure out anyway where it is, right? But still, do you want to facilitate that? We had one situation where we had a really, really, really current image, meaning from the day or from the day before, and we saw people sheltering in a situation of communal violence in like a backyard. We did not publish that image, right? It's as simple as that, because that might put people at risk. If I look at the drone bases, I can publish that image, but maybe I do not point out, these are the living quarters of the troops, this is the canteen. Somebody can just go to Google Earth and do that, right? But I cannot control that. What I can control is like what analysis and what images I publish, right? And that's what I have to be, very careful about.
Very good question. We have another up here.
Hi, José Lévesque from the Government of Canada. You mentioned the use of the utility to use thermal infrared. Is there any case where you could justify the utility of shortwave infrared bands?
I apologize. Is shortwave like the near infrared? Okay.
The 2 to 2.5 microns?
I think it's a very interesting question. I think it has outstripped certainly my technical capacity to answer it. Do you have any comments on shortwave infrared sensors and their potential uses?
No, but I'm going to go look it up now.
All right.
It's very used in the mining industry, for example, and you were talking about like uranium byproducts. So I was wondering if you had ever thought about looking at activities and that and some of these wavelengths. I don't know.
Well, I would just broadly say that we're pretty interested in new bands, but because they don't practically exist for us yet, we don't have the level of expertise that we would like to have. So I've read a few papers, but I think the only multispectral sensor that was available to us was Hyperion.
Yeah, and Sentinel too, but Sentinel's got it's got fewer bands than Hyperion.
Yeah, and so as a practical matter, when we looked at using them, and I had read some of the mining papers, we weren't able to do what we wanted to do, and so as an academic institution, that went on the back burner. But if as new bands become available, we'll try to move from this current position of ignorance, to a slightly more sophisticated position.
Yeah, just like Worldview 3 has 16 bands, that's probably the sensor you've used for the 8 bands multispectral. I'm not sure, but if you look at the other 8 bands, they are well centered at useful. So it would be nice to have planet imaging every day, everywhere with 16 bands. So
Yeah.
I
Oh,
wish
yeah. And then there's another company, Satellogic, I believe.
Somebody tell Will and Robbie to get on that.
There's another company that is doing the hyperspectral spectrum. The study that I've done was on an 8-band, and you were able to identify it. Well, we've corroborated with a couple of other things. You can use a multi and identify some of the mining signatures that you're talking about. But the study's early days, it's sort of in its infancy. We kind of have to kick the tires to understand that. And I think a lot of applications with multi and hyperspectral imagery are on the sort of emerging. It's a great question. You kind of stumped me. I appreciate it a lot.
It's a good audience.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question, and I think the person in the center there has got it.
I don't know if it's the ultimate question, but I was kind of curious what your take on like the role of geospatial information and satellite imagery in journalism, and how it's really kind of changed the telling of a story. And the audience you mentioned, not publishing that much on near infrared, which is harder to explain to the layman, but somebody with remote sensing eye would know. What's the role of remote sensing in the media? What are your views like right now in terms of how you tell a story? It's very broad, but I know there have been a lot of stories, and there are also stories of tweets that have images that people are not supposed to know about, and how the crowdsource was able to figure it out. But I'm just kind of curious your take.
It's of course incredibly important, but I'm very biased, and it saves my job obviously. So I think it's really important in two regards, right? On the one hand, and that's what I'm primarily interested in when I start a new project, is I want to gain some analytic insights, right? And so you really want to look for opportunities where the satellite images actually add some value, right? So the examples I mentioned at the beginning, North Korea, it's very clear you get access. You wouldn't have that information about these prison camps without the satellite images. So that's a very clear-cut traditional example. I could probably use satellite images for every single story, but what's the purpose? If it's just then a pretty picture, or in many cases it's a bad picture actually, and we had that recently, I think, sometimes. You see like of this ship-to-ship transfer off the coast of Syria, and it's this really big, like white extent picture and very cloudy, and you don't even explain where the tanker is, so the viewer or the reader has to find it in the satellite image. That's not very valuable in my perspective, right? So you really want to think about any sort of analytic insights and any sort of like added value in terms of reporting. What does remote sensing and geospatial data helped me to find out that I could not have done otherwise, right? That's number one. That's how it starts. On the other hand, comes the storytelling. And satellite images as a visual, right, can be extremely strong for storytelling. You have the challenge of sometimes you have to explain it. I had that so many times in my life, right? We have really good analytic insights, but then you publish a satellite image and you have to write 4 paragraphs about it to explain what you actually see, right? And that's very, very hard to do. So I prefer, of course, using satellite images and visuals that tell the story by themselves, right? So that's the ideal scenario. But our team, which is called Visual Investigations, right, we really look for visual evidence. And satellite images play a very important role. And in some stories, they're completely useless. So figuring that out and then using and presenting that information in a compelling way, I think that's really key, right? And luckily, I have some really good storytelling colleagues and really great video editors and graphics editors who can do all of that. Because bringing these two things together, I think, really, really creates almost a new field of journalism in a way.
I guess I'll just add to that. I think you said everything, but the thing that I would note is that like right now we're at a really interesting transition between really you could only use the satellite imagery for storytelling, and only now that journalists who aren't experts in geospatial information systems can look at a database over time and see change and like muck around and explore and not just send coordinates to someone and get something back a week later. We're only really starting to explore what we can learn from that kind of investigative technique really in the last couple of years. And Christoph has been a great pioneer of it. And I'll just share one of my favorite stories that I think maybe you both worked on, but it was in the New York, I'm not sure, but there was a story about an Iranian rocket factory that was building missiles that were likely beyond the capabilities that they said they would adhere to. And one of the reasons that reporters were able to analyze this factory and say what was going on is because you could use Planet satellites to see what color the roof was painted. You were not probably going to get a lot of human sources at a secure military facility in the middle of Iran. But knowing that a specific Iranian general really liked this specific color blue because it was his favorite soccer team, and he painted the roofs of the facilities he commanded that color, was one of the things that allowed them to corroborate that story. And I'm not sure you could have done that without satellite imagery. It's sort of a goofy example, but I think we're going to see in the future, as things get more sophisticated, actual real revelations coming from satellite imagery that we wouldn't have gotten any other way. And on that note, we are just about out of time. I don't know if you all have any final remarks or just find us afterwards for your questions and complaints. But thank you so much for listening and taking the time to be here at the Planet Explore Conference, and have a great afternoon.